Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're based in the world. My name is Giacomo Persi Paoli. I'm the program lead for security and technology at UNIDIR, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today to this very interesting webinar on new technological opportunities to bolster compliance with treaties. This is a joint event organized by the Security and Technology Program and the WMD and Other Strategic Weapons program at UNIDIR. And it's on a subject that is particularly close to my heart, because as part of our work in the emerging technology fields, we often have events that are dominated by the topic of risks and challenges that such technologies bring to the context of international security, disarmament, and arms control. However, this is only one side of the coin. The flip side of the coin, the positive side, is that these technologies, if properly leveraged, can offer great benefit to existing regimes. And this is really the core of this of today's event. So this panel will focus on opportunities, and specifically what new or otherwise underexplored technologies could offer in relation to monitoring and investigating compliance with WMD-related treaties, such as the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention. So this event is building on a forthcoming paper that will be published shortly by UNIDIR on the same subject as part of a series of papers on WMD compliance and enforcement. And we would like to thank the government of Norway that has made this work possible. So the work that UNIDIR has been conducting in this area has benefited from a number of experts. At this event today, I'm delighted to be joined by four excellent panelists. We have with us Veronica Borret, is a Senior Director at the La Trobe Institute for Agriculture and Food in Melbourne, Australia. And Veronica was the chair of the temporary working group on investigative science and technology of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. We also have with us Melissa Hanham. She's the Deputy Director at Open Nuclear Network and Director of the Data.io project. We have Jonathan Foreman, the Science and Technology Advisor at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and formerly Science Policy Advisor at the OPCW from 2013 to 2019. And last but not least, my colleague James Revel, who is a researcher at UNIDIR, specializing on this subject. I just would like to remind that all panelists today will be speaking in their personal capacity. The way this event is going to work is we're going to first go through a series of short presentations that are just going to help us setting the right scene. And presentations will be followed by a Q&A, classic Q&A discussion. Because we are quite constrained for time, instead of taking oral questions from the audience, I would encourage you to please use the Q&A function that is here on Zoom to submit your questions in writing. And please do not wait until the end of the presentations. As soon as you hear something that you would like to know more of, please submit your question right away. I will be collecting all the questions and do my best to have them answered over the course of the engagement and interaction with the speakers. The Q&A button can be found in the bar at the very bottom of the Zoom window. Other participants will not be able to see your question, but as I said, I'll try to weave them into the discussion as soon as possible. So, after this very short brief and introduction, I just would like to move to the substance. We have four very interesting interventions by our speakers, and the first is from Veronica. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to Veronica. Please, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Giacomo. Next slide, thank you. So one thing I've learned in my 30 years or so experience working in defence, supporting chemical and biological counterproliferation and verification activities associated with implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and also in CBR domestic preparedness, so working with emergency services and health agencies, is that one topic that comes up time and again is around remote standoff and automated systems. So how can we better approach the problems that we need to deal with? When we talk remote sensing, I mean, normally we're really focusing on satellite data, but in this presentation, I'm talking more broadly around remote sensing. So any system where there is a distance between the operator and the site or the item that's being evaluated. And another thing I've learned from experience too is, providing advice on technology solutions, is that you need to look at it, as a scientist, you need to look at it from the user perspective. So what are you trying to achieve? How does it contribute to the body of knowledge? And what compliance activities would benefit from the new approaches? Next slide, thanks. So before I get to the technologies, I'd like to make some general observations. Firstly, it's important to have a systems approach to the incorporation of any new technologies. So, asking the question of how do they interface with or complement other inputs. And this must be well understood, and it must be considered right from the very beginning, so and embedded right across the planning process. So we're talking about, embedding that systems approach right from the acquisition program through to the deployment of the new technologies. We also need to look at the level of expertise required, both for the deployment and the interpretation of the outputs. So, where or how is the expertise accessed? And it may be that, that the expertise is developed in-house, but in recent years, there's been, certainly in universities, a trend to cluster high-end platform technologies. So the advantage of this is that it's then much easier to surround that with the high-end specialist technicians who can, keep the equipment going and update it on a regular basis, and also have it surrounded by the academics who can provide the intellectual inputs, so that you make sure that you're getting the most appropriate analysis techniques and the expert interpretation. So therefore, you can then have that clustered and then be able to provide that access to that by large communities of users. And by having large communities of users, you also have a better approach to updating and remaining at the state of the art of those technologies. So that's something that needs to be considered. Do you do it in-house, or do you access broader technologies? Information management systems and their longevity need to look at information security, agnostic architecture, and robust transfer and storage systems. And robust systems and procedures, including chain of custody and data authentication, to ensure integrity of materials and data. For example, approaches such as blockchain or tracking systems. And it's essential to have an S&T review mechanism. Thank you. Next slide. So what potential opportunities do new technologies bring to compliance, and in the context of the CWC, particularly for non-routine and investigations of alleged use scenarios? UAVs and UGVs provide an opportunity to be able to do a lot of the planning at a distance. So providing greater safety and security and optimisation of the detection and sampling. Cameras, some of the benefits of using cameras is that you can do an assessment of the site before you enter it and determine what type of PPE is required. Best and safest approach routes, determining the sampling hotspots, and by that I mean, where is the best place to take a sample. And by doing this, you can then limit your time on site. So, and that would of course also limit your time in PPE and the heat burden associated with wearing PPE. You can also put detectors on uncrewed vehicles because they provide proximity to the site that might otherwise not be accessible. By putting detectors or sampling systems on a UAV or UGV, you're able then to, send in your detector and use the outputs of that to perhaps modify your access plan or determine your sampling hotspots, and then perhaps sending in a sampling system as the payload. And this may mean that you may avoid accessing the site altogether. Next slide, thanks. So those sorts of systems, UAVs and UGVs, are well used and various payloads used, but really it's about seeing how they're optimised for the particular application to verification that you're looking for. Imaging location and scene, 3D capture of the scene can provide a virtual walkthrough, and that might assist in determining the status of the facility during inspection compared to various points of time. And this is a tool that tends to require specialist users and can be rapidly evolving. So noting my earlier comments around whether it's better to access this through agreements or develop in-house. Likewise for satellite data, which can pick up unusual activities, movements or objects, pick up chemical plumes and or other signatures of chemical release. And while commercial satellite data is widely accessible and can be used for retrospective analysis or proactive monitoring, it's really the expert interpretation of that information that's the essential part of the capability. And also, you need expert selection of the appropriate high and low resolution imagery. So again, it's the type of capability that you may reach out to other organisations or capabilities to provide. Next slide. Standoff detectors, when you look at, standoff Raman, infrared LiDAR, these have been around for decades, and normally they're used for direct assessment of a site, and so that's, and often in combination with other detection systems. What's not used as often is indirect sensors, using these as indirect sensors. And it's an approach that's long been used in agriculture because plants are very sensitive to their environment, and imaging can provide a record of their exposure to the environment. So this is because that plants have chemical signatures that are acutely impacted by changes in the environment, including chemical exposure, and that can be detected by these imaging systems. So potentially, and there needs to be a lot more work done, they could be detectors for both exposure as well as time stamping of exposure with plants as sensor arrays. And finally, GPS tracking systems, and these are also common in agriculture, and have been developed for use in supply chains, for example, tracking the condition of fresh foods. And as such, they're increasingly small, disposable devices, and they can be used both for tracking and also reporting on conditions. So some of them, use sensing of heat, humidity, oxygen, carbon monoxide, and a range of other parameters. And so that can give you an indication of what's going on during shipment. But they can also, as well as detecting the ambient conditions, they can indicate an event, such as when a container was opened, and you would see a change resulting from that event or activity. Thank you. So just the final comments. It's critical that we continually review science and technology relevant to bolstering compliance with treaties. How we do that is one aspect, but we must not lose sight of the process, that the process needs to be driven by the verification requirements and not driven by the technology. So evaluation of new technologies must be done with an understanding and a clear definition of the requirement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Veronica, for your brief on remote sensing and remote sensors, and also for highlighting the importance of always considering technology as a part of a system. Technology itself is not necessarily able to offer much advantage if it's not integrated into a wider system where skills and expertise and access and processes and procedures are also as important. I'd like to give the floor now to Melissa. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to speak, and I think some of the points that Veronica already touched upon are really useful to think about as we move to remote sensing data, particularly from satellites. I think the first point I'd like to make is that we're really in a different world than we were in the Cold War. At that time, really, it was the Soviet Union and the United States which had national technical means that could share or receive and share this information only within their own intelligence communities. And one of the, I think, great benefits of the explosion in commercially available remote sensing data is that it's an equalizer. Now, regardless of whether a state has national technical means, or even a person in civil society like myself, you can purchase satellite imagery or other data from companies. That's not to say that it's cheap or easy to use, but that it's increasingly lowering the barriers to access to this vital information. I think the other distinction I wanted to make from some of the remarks that Veronica spoke about is that unlike some of the autonomous drones and other sensors that she described, satellites orbit in space. And so when we think about sovereignty issues, space-based sensors can make a big difference in the way we are able to monitor certain places. There are certainly drawbacks as well. None of the sensors that she described on the ground are nearly as accurate or high fidelity when they are far away up in space. So you have to think about the trade-off of when you might use one device versus another. If a state is actively giving you permission to have an inspection with humans and these devices, then by far that is the superior choice. But if you're doing something else, like doing a monitoring or activity where there is either violence or natural disasters, or you do not have permission from the state to enter a territory, then satellite becomes a really good second option. I think one of the most important things to note is how far the technology has come since the Cold War. So first of all, there are more sensors than ever before orbiting in space. Thousands of sensors at this point. In fact, discussing space junk is one of the biggest issues to maintaining the quality of space for satellites. The other is that there are more operators of these satellites than ever before. Some of them are government, some of them are civilian, and some of them are corporate, or even we're getting to a place where individuals can own a satellite in space. And with a variety of operators and a variety of different states who can give access, it really breaks down that you or me mentality where there are only those who have and those who wish they had satellite capabilities. The other area I'd like to draw attention to is the capabilities themselves. So during the Cold War, the US had the Corona satellites, which collected data on film. The data was only available in panchromatic, meaning black or white, and that this had to be recovered from a capsule at great difficulty and expense. And at that time, if you were lucky and you got the actual film, you could develop it, you could send it to an expert who might use a Gerber scale to measure and take notes. That expert might not understand what they're seeing, so they would have to send it to a different kind of expert who perhaps had regional knowledge or engineering knowledge or technical knowledge that the interpreter didn't have. And this was very labor-intensive activity. With the digitization of information and the vast number of different types of data that we can now collect, we're able to create a much more robust understanding of what's happening on the ground. So just as Veronica spoke about plant sensitivity and using sensors to detect the changes, from space we can do the same thing at slightly, the cost of being far away. So you can collect not just the red, green, and blue light that the human eye can see, but you can collect a vast array of bands that the human eyes cannot see. Of particular note are near-infrared band of light. This band of light reflects very well off of healthy vegetation. So you can see when there's been a disruption from a missile launch. You can see when camouflage is laid out, for example. This carries all the way out to the thermal infrared bands of light, which can give us information about temperature, which is another useful tool that can be used for monitoring. Still more exciting than using these individual bands is using them together in a block, which is called hyperspectral data. And taking a block, for example, there's a sensor on the International Space Station which has 235 individual slices of the electromagnetic spectrum that it's collecting beyond the human visibility range. And it forms a kind of spectroscopy. And you can essentially get a fingerprint or a signature of what a type of material on the ground is. And that can be mineral, it can be related to the paint on the paint on a vehicle, and so on and so forth. And these are beginning to become available in commercial spaces, but are still quite expensive. We're also able to collect synthetic aperture radar in the public sector now. So this is an active sensor which bounces a signal off the ground and collects it. The benefit being that you can see at night, you can see through clouds, and you can use quite amazing machine learning products to compare very minute differences, particularly trucks that are traveling on dusty or arid roads, to get a sense of how often roads are being patrolled, for example. One of the tools that really is increasing the usability of this is the application of machine learning. There is now too much data for an individual to analyze, and we must have some assistance so that we can focus humans on the most complex and difficult analytical projects and allow the machine to sort of triage where to look first or which signatures are of most interest. Using things like change detection and object detection helps the human analyst sift through far more imagery that they would be able to look at manually to give them hints about either construction happening, deviations in what you would expect in shipping traffic, or even mining activities. And also identifying unusual objects like surface-to-air missiles, which could be associated with military facilities, for example. A lot of this is still very nascent and very experimental in the public sector, but I would wager that it is evolving more rapidly there because there are so many more people in universities and in the public sector which are trying to crack this issue than there are in individual governments. So how can we best apply these tools to arms control problems? Regardless of whether you're considering biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons, or even the delivery devices of such weapons, there are signatures of the development of those programs, which inspectors may already know about because they have been to that place or walked there. Those signatures can be vast, and they are often very difficult for a machine to understand. So this is still primarily the domain of a really seasoned expert who understands these facilities. Some facilities like nuclear reactors are very easy to identify because they have a fixed number of designs which are well known to the world. Other facilities like a chemical production facility may be very difficult to identify because there are so many similar industrial facilities which have the same appearance. Still more complicated are dual use facilities, where a facility may be used for one civilian purpose, but at other times used for a military purpose. But with the general knowledge of the facility and how a facility should operate, you can monitor consistently for traffic patterns, activity at different times of the day, or when special events happen, or when an inspection team is there versus when an inspection team is not there. And all of this can paint a pattern of life. This pattern of life gives us a sense of what is normal and what is anomalous, and can give valuable feedback to analysts who are trying to interpret whether someone is in compliance or not. I think that the last note I want to touch on is that, as you can tell from my remarks, this is no longer the domain of just states. Civil society is deeply involved in the analysis, development, and even procurement of commercial and other satellite imagery. I feel that while this is a net gain for the world, because you have more people, more types of expertise, openly discussing changes in the world, there is also a place for ethical acknowledgement of the risk that can be associated with someone who perhaps does not have enough expertise to fully understand the situation, or even with the unintentional assistance to a country in understanding how inspections may take place, or how they could divert material in a way that would be less detected. These ethical questions are only now being unpacked and addressed as the technical capacity really has grown. And there is no routinized system for open source analysts to apply their knowledge and build ethical norms around this. A consortium of analysts in the world have met under the auspices of the Stanley Center, as well as my own organization, the Center for the Open Nuclear Network, to put together some ethical ideas. And we ourselves have adopted a code of ethics, but I encourage states to provide assistance to the civil society organizations who may be using satellite imagery for interpretation to help grow their capacity in ethics as well as technology. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa, for your inspiring remarks. That I think there are three key trends that you have highlighted that I think are all very relevant. One is the increased sophistication in the technology that is becoming better, way better than it used to be. At the same time, there is a trend towards democratization of space capabilities or space access, where it is not only the kind of prerogative of state actors, but so the capabilities and the assets deployed in space have now belong to private sector, commercial, or even private individuals, as you said. And then the third trend that for me is very important is also the expansion of the knowledge and skill set and kind of intellectual capability to make sense of the data and the information that is made available through this increase in both capabilities and numbers, which I think is three really important trends that I would like to explore further during the Q&A. Which reminds me to please invite all of the audience to submit your questions in writing if you want throughout the panels. Don't wait until the very end. There is the Q&A function at the very bottom of the Zoom window. Please do submit your questions whenever you're ready. And it's now time for me to give the floor to Jonathan. And Melissa kind of started to introduce the concept of AI and digitization. So it's probably the perfect bridge for you to take us through your presentation now.
Okay, well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening, depending on which part of the world that you happen to be in. Let's see if I can minimize this. All right. So we're talking about new technologies and emerging technologies and how they might help us with some of the non-proliferation work that we're interested in. And I really like what Melissa said about how we are living in a different world these days. And one of the hallmarks of the age that we live in is that we've been seeing this pretty amazing digital transformation for the last few decades. And it's really been exponentially growing in the past 20 years, affects the way that we think about how to do business. It also changes some of the ways that we even do our day-to-day life business. There are constantly new offerings, tools, and capabilities. They change rapidly. So it's interesting to think about it as emerging technology because in a sense it has emerged, but it's constantly changing and dynamic. What's made all of this possible in the last 2 decades is what tools that we refer to as artificial intelligence. And it's an interesting term, artificial intelligence, because depending on where you look for a definition, you can find a lot of different views of what it is. Anything from intelligent machines and general AI to more narrow AI, which is really the artificial intelligence of a lot of the digitalization that we see, which is a confluence of computational power, algorithms, and data. That confluence of those three components is really just another component of a larger system. So an AI is the component of a self-driving car, for example. Without the AI, the car can't drive. But then again, without parts in the engine and wheels and other essential parts of the car, the AI can't make the car drive. So these things are all related and not necessarily as fancy as the general AI concept. In talking about non-proliferation and advances in science and technology, the narrative is one of AIs being adopted across scientific fields. It's creating a lot of rapid advances. And as Giacomo mentioned in the beginning, it gives us a lot of pause for how these things may be used in nefarious ways. And these are important things to consider, but it's also important to consider that the same enabling capabilities that are coming out of these tools may also help us in meeting some of the security challenges that we face. The Chemical Weapons Convention actually encourages this, although it's not often talked about. Its Article 8 suggests that a consideration should be given to making use of advances in science and technology for this verification purposes. And that theme has been an underlying part of the work of OPCW's Scientific Advisory Board the past few years. It's also important to point out that digitalization is not absent from chemical disarmament. The electronic declaration systems that OPCW now uses and has been developing for several years are an example of the digitalized world that we live in. Moving on to chemicals and chemistry, we talk about a fourth industrial revolution, basically a convergence or coupling of cyber and physical systems, really digitalization driving manufacturing. We talk about digitalized factories where data is collected and robotic systems move parts and goods through a system that is tracked along the way. If you think about the amount of money that's being spent bringing these factories online, it's hard to say that they are the factories of the future. Rather, they are an example of what is possible being adopted for routine use. You can think of a connected chemical factory, but the digitalization is far more than just producing chemicals. You have aspects across the entire life cycle of the chemical product, the supply chain, and even interaction with customers in this integrated digitalized system to allow businesses to do things in different and possibly more efficient ways. And with all this connectivity and tracking of data, one can look at certain aspects that fit with some of the non-proliferation work that we're interested in. Regulatory information can be associated with every step of a chemical product or life cycle. Transfers of chemicals can be more easily tracked. And you can think about sampling and data analysis as opposed to sampling and chemical analysis. And this is just describing data that's available to look at. As Melissa mentioned, we have so much data, what do we do with it? This is where tools like machine learning come in, which machine learning can be thought of as algorithms and statistical data models that can take data and make predictions, recognize patterns, help us to decipher what we're looking at and make better decisions from it. Chemical identification is one area that benefits a lot from advanced informatics. Think about the Chemical Weapons Convention and its schedules. I think it's common that we think of this as a list of chemicals that need to be controlled, but the schedules are actually much more than a list. The Schedule 1A1, which contains the chemical sarin, is actually described by a set of words that, if you're not a chemist, probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but the translation into practicality is that it describes more than 2 million possible chemical structures. If you think about fentanyls, you can have many analogs of fentanyl, and these analogs are created by adding or subtracting atoms from the molecular structure. Think of the atoms as letters that spell words that tell you what the molecule is, and by changing the spelling, you can alter the potency of the drug, and you also create chemicals that no longer fall on any list, because unlike the Chemical Weapons Convention, lists of narcotics tend to list individual chemicals, not families of related structures. This vast chemical space can be a real challenge if you don't have analytical data or reference standards when you're making chemical analysis and trying to identify chemicals you may not have encountered before. Chemical informatics in the computational world allows you to generate a multitude of chemical structures and actually predict what some of the data might look like should you do a certain type of chemical analysis. And this can help you in identifying samples and new chemicals that you may come across. This has been demonstrated and used in a number of applications, so it's not something new, but there are always questions. Can you trust theoretically generated reference data, or do you need the actual chemical to always compare to? You can also couple informatics with another type of automated system, a biological system. You can think of a biological system as this interaction of omes, genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, and metabolomics. These chemicals in biological systems generate other chemicals, and a chemical exposure that is disruptive to the system changes the patterns and identities of chemicals that are being produced in these processes, the metabolomes, for example. So you can start thinking about looking at patterns of chemicals instead of looking for that one unique chemical marker to describe a chemical exposure. And this could be useful when you have limited information about the biological effect of a toxic chemical. Characterizing metabolomes using AI tools is also not new. It's used a lot when looking at markers of exposure and trying to understand how to design better medical countermeasures. You can very easily think about it as a way to also recognize chemicals created by biological systems after exposure. This idea gets into recognizing chemical exposure without actually recognizing chemicals, toxidromes, toxic effects of chemicals. If you had indicators, perhaps physiological, non-invasive indicators that could be collected and would tell you that something was wrong with health status, you could then generate information that may not identify the chemical, but could certainly correlate with a chemical exposure. And there's a lot of work in healthcare now, high performance medicine it's called, integrating these type of approaches. There's also the idea of computer vision. I take a picture of the leaf of a plant and my algorithm tells me that my plant, in this case, is suffering from phosphorus deficiency. These apps are not science fiction. You can actually download them from the Google Play Store. And it's not much of a stretch to think about, could this app recognize unique signs of specific toxic industrial chemical exposure? The answer is probably no, because the apps were trained for houseplants and food crops. But if one had a training set, you could make a similar app for chemical exposure to certain types of vegetation. Many more applications are possible. You can think of old munitions, looking at pictures and having an algorithm help you identify whether it's a chemical munition or not. And there's even been examples where people have shown that you can recognize export controlled items with computer vision. All of this kind of rolls up into what I'd like to think of as a holistic, threat agnostic approach to non-proliferation of chemicals. So think about recognizing specific signs and symptoms that tells you some kind of chemical, maybe not the chemical itself, there's been an exposure. That helps you think about prevention and mitigation of effects. You can think about tools that give you information about chemicals in ways that helps find their provenance. And also, from a counterproliferation standpoint, all of these data streams together can give you a lot of information to cross-correlate and help you make better and more robust conclusions. The question will always come up though, how reliable is AI? Can you trust it? Machine learning, these are the models that we use. When they see data sets that they've never seen before, that were different than what they've been trained on, sometimes they have problems working. We've seen that recently with changes in online shopping algorithms. We've also seen both success and failure when you bring AI systems into healthcare, and it all comes down to the data that the systems were trained on and the kind of data that they actually see. So digitalization and non-proliferation, I think it's here, and I think what's important if we want to take advantage of it is to recognize where the capabilities help us and where rather than where they're kind of hyped, if you will. I think it's a good question to ask. Do new tools build greater confidence and trust? I think they certainly can, but what does it take to get them to do that? Nevertheless, we have new approaches to overcome new challenges. And I think, coming to Giacomo's point in the beginning, we have all these opportunities from new technologies. We can't be afraid of the new technologies, but we do have to understand how we can use them and how we can trust them. So with that, I will end here and happy to answer questions and discuss with the rest of you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for a great presentation, just explaining to all of us what is the range of the possibilities that have been unlocked by some of these emerging technologies. But thank you also for raising the point that there is a lot of hype and a lot of noise, and our ability to leverage these technologies to achieve effect is directly related to our ability to identify the signal among the noise, which means like the individual narrow application that can really, well, there is a business case for the further refinement and development of these technologies. And also, thank you for bringing to the table the issue that just because something is proving to be promising or even working very well in a controlled environment, it doesn't necessarily perform as well once it transitions into the real world. There is, in the technology community, this issue is often referred to as the sim to real gap, so the gap between a simulated environment and the real world. And I think this is kind of a cross-cutting issue that goes from a single AI application to what you mentioned earlier with autonomous driving, which is kind of the integration of AI into physical systems, which of course unlocks a whole new field of issues related to reliability testing and evaluation. So lots to discuss. I hope we'll have time. So before we transition to the Q&A, we have one last presentation from James Revel. James, over to you.
Thank you, Giacomo, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where this finds you. And thank you for joining this event. Also, I'd like to thank the previous panelists who have rather nicely set up my short contribution to this discussion, and I will be brief. But just to note that Veronica, Jonathan and Melissa are all authors in a forthcoming report, which forms part of UNIDIR's WMD Compliance and Enforcement series. I'm delighted that they and 17 others from around the world have been able to contribute. This also includes contributions from Dr. Gunnar Jeremias, head of the Hamburg Research Group for Biological Arms Control, who has written about the potential of open source trade data in the biological weapons regime. So the report itself looks at the role of novel technologies in enhancing compliance mechanisms within specific regimes. But at the same time, what we've also tried to do is to provide a healthy dose of realism in the discussion. I think this is important, because whilst I agree with Melissa's point that these technologies are exciting, there is nonetheless a gap between what is theoretically possible and the ground of reality. Moreover, the process of adoption depends on political, social, and economic, as well as technological factors. It requires that new technologies have a perceived relative advantage over what currently exists for users, and that these perceived advantages outweigh some of the perceived disadvantages. In this regard, I think it's perhaps important to recognize that some states may view new approaches as too complex, biased, discriminating, or overly expensive. The second point that, as Veronica has pointed out earlier on, realizing the potential of new technologies may require access to specific equipment and technical expertise. Neither the equipment nor the expertise will necessarily be readily available in international organizations or to states. So there may therefore be a need to work with external bodies and interact with different regimes in order to get customized equipment and to be able to draw upon the necessary specialist knowledge. Third, and I think this relates to a point made by both Melissa and Jonathan, these sorts of technologies could produce significant amounts of data, potentially too much data for humans to manage. So in addition to looking at the possible roles of AI and machine learning, it also seems prudent to think about systems which would be able to securely collect, manage and store data in a way that it could be drawn upon as and when it's required and by appropriate actors. Finally, yet perhaps most importantly, I think to be useful, states and relevant international organizations will need to collectively validate technologies and the associated procedures for their use. This requires building on the existing discussions and undertaking rigorous processes of scientific review and testing, including testing approaches in the operational environments where that's required. This seems to me to be really important if states are to have confidence in the technologies, as well as the confidentiality, the integrity and the security of the data that they can produce. It also seems to me to be important to try and do this in advance of their use. Efforts to apply new technologies at pace and under pressure can create vulnerabilities. Moreover, I think technologies alone are not sufficient to strengthen WMD treaties. We can't automate assessment processes for compliance or black box processes for monitoring regimes. Seasoned expertise is still going to be required, as Melissa pointed out. Nonetheless, as we start to see arms control disarmament and non-proliferation regimes increasingly under pressure, and that's something which I think is evident in many of the statements in the first committee, it seems important to keep an eye not just on the potential risks from developments in technology, but also the potential opportunities that new tools offer in terms of addressing future arms control and disarmament challenges and building confidence in compliance with WMD regimes in the 21st century. I'll leave it to that, but thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Giacomo.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for your remarks on adoption that for me are critical, because you know, these technologies can only bring benefit and provide effect to the extent that they will be adopted and integrated into existing processes and practices. So we have about 25 minutes to discuss these issues. I'm very happy that we already have 4 questions coming from the floor. I'm just going to pose them to the panel as a whole. Where I can identify kind of a first respondent or a primary respondent, I will do so. But everybody, please, feel free to chip in. So the first question, I guess, is a direct follow-up to Melissa's presentation, which is reads as follows. So given the proliferation and democratization of data and sources, how can policymakers begin to filter this out? What can be done to protect against potential manipulation, politicalization, or even just bias? So how do we deal with kind of a data proliferation?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer that will satisfy the questioner, but one of the things that humans have become very reliant on are their own sensors, our eyes, our ears, our smell, our tongue. And as we receive more and more news of deep fakes, manipulation of images and video and even sound, it makes us very nervous. But the truth is that even though these fakes can trick our eyes and our ears, they cannot yet trick machines. And so unfortunately, my answer is more algorithms. We are going to have to go to an uncomfortable place in the world where you may no longer be able to trust your eyes and ears. And instead, you will need to rely on algorithms which mathematically dissect the sound waves of a voice, or identify pixel duplication, or a change in the noise of the light, or the chrominescence, the color in an image, and can tell when something has been artificially introduced. I do think, though, that companies, particularly commercial providers, should perhaps adopt systems where the image from the sensor to the distribution and to the different individual users can have a kind of chain of evidence associated with it that allows the user to feel confident that they are getting an authentic image. And I also think if a state is ever answering an inquiry from an inspecting agency, that they should also make sure that they provide an original piece of information. One of the common things that we've seen in court cases now is that you want to check the original image with the original metadata associated with that piece of an image. And often what can be produced, so for example, you could theoretically fake a satellite image, but if a state was providing that as a piece of evidence, it would be very easy for the IAEA or some other organization to say, I'm sorry, but this is not the original image. Please provide the original image with the original metadata files associated with it. And those types of tools can streamline some of the possibilities.
Thank you. Does anybody else on the panel want to contribute to this discussion on data and proliferation of data or sources?
Sure, I just can add to what Melissa said, that we're in a place where if you have a piece of information and you don't trust it, what are other pieces of information that can corroborate that or show you that it's not connected. And that in some ways requires that we have better ability to manipulate or not manipulate's a bad word, but a better ability to process and analyze data to make those assessments that something is false or not false.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that. Are there any other comments from Jamie or Veronica on this? No? If not, oh, Veronica, please.
Yeah, just sort of picking up on that as well in terms of, if there is an incident, it's likely that the first pictures or indications of it are, people on their, smartphones or social media. And that's an area that's, probably most likely to be, where you might find challenges to the authenticity of that information. And again, picking up on Melissa's point around metadata and forensic analysis of data, and those sorts of analysis is well developed in the forensic community and can be applied to that. And there are also a number of apps that are designed to verify the veracity of information. So it becomes both a challenge and, the technologies can also provide solutions to that.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two of the questions that came from the floor, which both relate to the issue of transferability of these emerging technologies that we've been discussing in the context of kind of the chemical context to, in what ways can these technological advances, be transferred to the context of, a verification regime for biological weapons or for nuclear, for example. So in what way can these technologies be transferred to those domains as well? And this is an open question to all of you, whoever wants to go first.
Just make sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to make a general comment in terms of biological weapons convention. I mean, clearly the sorts of, the verification will be different to what you would use in other treaties and certainly in the Chemical Weapons Convention, but there is potential for the same tools to be applied and considered within the provisions of the treaty. And I think what there is huge value in is the sharing of the S&T insights across the scientific community, but also, with technical evaluation activities and sharing of those, and engagement with the science advice mechanisms across various regimes. And I think, support for that type of engagement, scientific engagement across organisations, should be encouraged and is very important.
Yeah, if I could follow up on that, Giacomo, I think, of course, the sort of technologies being discussed here can't be cut and paste from one regime to another. But at the same time, reading through some of the contributions in the paper, it was really interesting when thinking about some of the potential role of these novel technologies and how they could potentially feed into building greater confidence in compliance in the biological weapons regime. So Veronica has discussed sort of 3D capture of a scene, standoff detectors. Then Melissa's discussion on satellite technologies. Taking that as an example, the last time satellite technology was discussed in the sort of multilateral forum of the BWC was probably back in about the early 90s in the VEREX process. Things like the ground spatial resolution has improved significantly since then. So it seems it could be an interesting discussion to have. There are clearly long-standing political issues around the topic, and things can't be cut and paste, but it seems an interesting area of study to me.
Thank you.
I can comment on this in a more general way. I think if you're thinking about, you're looking for something or you're looking to corroborate some information, you need the appropriate data inputs. And that depends on what is it that you're trying to get information on and what can you look at that correlates to that information. And these tools can be applied conceptually in that way to all kinds of problems. You just have to think through what it would take to actually solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And to Jamie's point, there are things that are possible now that weren't possible in 1972 or 1950. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is it gives us a different way of doing things, maybe a new way of doing things. That new or different way doesn't necessarily work better than what we have. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, and that all is things that remain to be seen.
I think there may be some building blocks of how to apply these techniques that probably do cross a lot of the regimes. And there could be a kind of introductory or data literacy program that would bring the conceptual nature of these tools up. And then each of those regimes, which are obviously not cookie cutter situations, can then run with those ideas to see how they may be best applied.
And I think that speaks to Veronica's point about a science advisory mechanism. This is where you really want people that can spend some time thinking very, very, in detail on what these technologies do and how they might be applied to the problem that they're considering.
Perfect. Thank you all. Glad you could all engage with this question. I have two more questions that are somehow related, and I'm going to try to combine them into one, and I'm very pleased to see more coming. So one reads as follow. One of the challenges of proliferation detection, particularly when dealing with dual-use technologies, is distinguishing between peaceful and illicit behavior of people, facilities, or programs. Can predictive analytics, modeling future behavior based on various inputs, be useful here? And somehow related to this question is another one that reads, that looks at, how can we assess the net effect of this development, all of these developments for WMD proliferations, building on the assumptions that technological progress provides more and better tools for both proliferators and counter-proliferators.
I'll take a shot at it.
Please.
Very good, very difficult questions to answer. Many of the illicit trade activities that we see at sea are not so different from real legitimate trade activities that we see. The chain of travel and procurement is quite complex these days. One of the things that I think is really hard to capture is how beneficial an understanding of the pattern of life may be at a certain place. And if you are able to gather some baseline data and routinely check over and over and over and over again, you will be able to see when something is anomalous and when something is not. And you may not always know why if you're using a complex algorithm, but the underlying principle is if someone is going to work every day and they have a product deadline or they have a shipment that must be met or so on and so forth, that presents one type of activity at a place. But if there is something unusual, facility operating under additional hours or using a different amount of electricity or where invoices don't match the throughput of what's happening, then you might say, well, this is anomalous and requires further investigation. So even though many of the dual use complications are still very difficult to sort out, particularly in places like the chemical weapons domain, I think that if we are able to build some of the facilities along the lines that Jonathan described, it can really help us collect enough data to see what is a normal activity and what is an anomalous event.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think what these tools allow you to do is recognize things that are unusual. And sometimes you might follow up on something that looks unusual and find out that there's nothing wrong going on. And other times, maybe that unusual observation may lead you to something that prevents an incident. And one example I can think of is the bombings that took place in London in 2005. The people that made the bombs were using chemicals, chemical-based explosives. They were working in a small room, and they opened a window to get ventilation so they didn't have to breathe the chemical fumes. And the leaves of the plants outside the window ended up dying from chemical exposure. And in the investigation after the incident, people noticed, people remembered that. And they said, oh yeah, it was unusual. We saw the leaves of the plants right at the windowsill were dead. But most people don't think about dead leaves as anything unusual. But if you were thinking about it in a very holistic sense, why do you see that pattern of plant stress versus another? And that could have prevented the bombings if somebody had noticed and thought it was unusual enough to look further. It's not a WMD example, but I think it's a conceptual, kind of speaks to the point.
Yes, can I jump in on this as well, Giacomo? I mean,
Yeah.
just on the predictive analysis, I think it's a question from Tracy. I agree it could be used to flag anomalies. One of the concerns I would have in relation to CBW is that we don't necessarily have a good enough data set, a good enough historical account. There are gaps, there is doubtless spin in there, and it's fundamentally contested history. So trying to make sense of that and draw on that data, use that input to try and reach some sort of predictive analysis, I think would be quite ambitious, but certainly for flagging anomalies. And that kind of leads to the idea that in addition to all these tools, there's also going to need to be some sort of space to engage and address anomalies between whichever set, well, between states, certainly.
And I just like to follow up on that, because the issue of predictive algorithms, I mean, it's detecting anomaly is focused on the present. So you're using historical data or your data set to identify an anomaly, like a signal of anomaly in the present. Some of the more kind of advanced applications of predictive algorithms are trying to use kind of almost like breadcrumbs of historical and current data to predict future behavior. And this is, an area in which, some, for example, in judicial system, these have been also, it's an area where these sort of predictive algorithms have been particularly looked at. But it would be, interested, to know if and how you could see the more kind of future-oriented use of these algorithms in the context of WMD. But before I do that, because I want to give priority to the questions coming from our audience, we have a question that reads as follows. And given that only Western developed countries have access to modern technologies, how to increase trust in them from developing countries, and how to ensure chain of custody of the evidences of possible violations, not to put blame on an individual player. Melissa, would you like to have a go at it?
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is probably one of the most important questions that has been asked about how to build trust. And I think this is going to be the fundamental challenge to new technologies. One of the best things I see right now is a diversification of sources. And as I said before, it's no longer just the Soviet Union and the US that have satellites, but there are now satellites all over the world. These still tend to be countries with advanced space programs that have an advanced edge, but I no longer, when I go shopping for satellite imagery, I no longer have to only buy from the US. In fact, if the United States, for example, were to choose the resolution that I wanted to look at over Israel, I could go to a different country and buy satellite imagery from a different country and instead use that. And in addition to different countries having these sensors, there's also more sensors than ever before. So if you think that one sensor is somehow incorrect or untrustworthy, you can attempt to corroborate that information with other sensors, and not necessarily just other satellite sensors, but as Veronica pointed out, phones on the ground, a whole range of sensors that can do it. The question on the chain of custody, I think, is a lot more difficult to answer. And I think this is an area where we really have to pressure companies, universities, and those putting satellites up to to ensure that they bake in the chain of custody from the start. Right now, my organization, Open Nuclear Network, is trying to build a data platform which does this from the start. So as we collect a piece of trade data, a piece of satellite imagery, or if we use an algorithm, we identify it directly in the source. And every human who comments or contributes to that, they also get added to the source. So when the final information is presented in what we call a gallery, all the sources from the data, the algorithms, the humans are all listed there. And we don't do that just because we're trying to make a best practice, but because if someone challenges our finding, we want to be able to go backwards and find out if there was a mistake, where was the mistake made, so that we can declare it publicly.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. Anybody else would like to contribute to this question? Please,
Yeah, I can just comment that this is kind of the thought behind blockchains and how you can attach tags, or so to speak, or append something to data so that it follows a traceable chain of custody. So people think about these things. How well do they work? How well do you trust them? I think are open discussions, but there's certainly a lot of thought that's been put into this.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to make the same point, Jonathan, but also to add to, it's not just that you've got the chain in custody which shows the integrity of the information or the data or whatever it might be. You need to be able to show or demonstrate that integrity as well. So you know, that's sort of, and that goes back to the point around trust that Melissa brought up and you brought up along the way as well.
Yeah. So I think we have one last time for just one last question from the floor, which is, are there any national technical means for BWC verification?
Yeah. Sorry, can I, just on the last two questions that are up there in front of me at least. I think national technical means are often quite limited in terms of the BWC. It also depends to some extent on what is meant by verification. That has assumed quite different meanings depending on who you speak to. I think there are tools with which you could perhaps build a much better picture of another's compliance. But I think that picture is still going to be quite abstract with using national technical means. You're not going to have a clear or a precise picture. There's going to be ambiguity. So I think there are limits to national technical means, but the tools we've been discussing here could perhaps get further. And if I just may also respond to the question from the last question on from the Russian mission, I think it's important, and in the report we actually sort of raise this by pointing to the importance of having diversity and capacity and expertise to try and do this. I think that's something which is important to work on moving forward as well. Sorry, thanks, Giacomo.
No, thank you. Thank you, Jamie. So we have just a couple of minutes before, unfortunately, having to close this meeting, but I wanted to check, give our panelists one last chance to share with us their final last thoughts, either, to engage on issues that didn't come up in the Q&A that you think are important, or particular messages that you would like to stress. So I just go in the same order as our original contributions, starting with Veronica. If you have a 30-second highlight that you would like to share with us.
Thanks, Giacomo. This has been an excellent event, and thanks to all of those who put this together. I think for me, one of the most important things is that dialogue between science and diplomats, and with an understanding of what the technology needs to be able to do, and then the discussion around how that technology is going to do that. So with the requirements driving the technology and not the technology driving the solution.
Thank you, Veronica. Melissa, over to you. Oh, have we lost Melissa? why don't we go to Jonathan then?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Veronica said. These are very important points. The other thing that I think is good to bring up here is we're talking about new technologies. Some of them aren't particularly new if you think about how they're being adopted in more a broader sense, the digital transformation. But it gives us an opportunity to think about things in different ways and think about new approaches to solving problems that perhaps we haven't been able to solve in the past. The new approaches may not work, but I think it gives us new ways to think about things, and those new ways may help us to overcome some of the challenges that we currently seek. Not saying it's easy, but I think it's important to use your imagination a bit. Don't constrain yourself by what technologies of the past have limited us by.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jamie, over to you.
Nothing further from me beyond saying thank you to panelists and participants for joining us at this event, and to yourself, Giacomo, as well. Yeah, have a good day, evening, night, wherever this finds you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jamie. So, well, it's time to close this meeting, but before I do so, I just wanted to express our gratitude to our panelists for their excellent presentations, to the UNIDIR team that produced this event, particularly to our colleagues Letitia and Emma. And of course, thanks to the Norwegian government for their support to our WMD compliance and enforcement research. And last but not least, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us and for contributing with very interesting and thought-provoking questions to this event. You will have seen in the chat box we have shared with you the link to our feedback form. Please do take 30 seconds to tell us what you thought about the event. It will help us improve in the future. You will also be receiving an email with the same link, just to make sure you don't forget to share feedback. UNIDIR's work around WMD compliance and enforcement is ongoing. There will be more in the coming months. So we hope to see you all in the future, and hope that you engage with our reports and activities and you find them useful. So thanks again to all for your time, and have a good day or night, depending on where you are. Thank you again.